Hi everyone. I want to talk about a kontakt script that I've made. I've been sitting on this one for a while and just finally got around to putting the finishing touches on it to get it out there. It's called Neighbors, and it is a borrowing resampler. So I had put out this script a couple years ago called NTET, and one of the modules in that was the same kind of idea, which is essentially you borrow samples from a different part of the keyboard for a multi-sample instrument, like say you have something like this. And so you're borrowing samples from one section to play them in another section, and they're just getting repitched. And in effect, what happens is you get these interesting timbre changes. So you can make something sound darker or brighter, or anything in between. And you can get some pretty interesting results. This is great for older sample libraries. This is as an example, this is a pretty old piano multi-sample instrument that you can see. Like if I just, this is basically just in setup mode right now. So if I just play it, it's pretty basic sounding, old school kind of piano patch. But you can make it sound like a honky tonk piano. You could make it sound weird in interesting ways. So I just want to run through the features set of this and show you how to use it. The first step is to set it up. So basically you can set up the range of samples that it uses. So the quickest way to do this would be, assuming you just want to use the whole range of an instrument, you just kind of click the lowest key or play the lowest key. This is A-1, and we'll just pop that in there. And then we'll find the highest key, which is this one, C7. We'll pop that in. And so now you can see that this is updated. And now we'll just kind of hop in and I'll show you some of the different modes. So the first mode is called tile mode. And basically what this does is it lets you limit a multi-sample instrument to a single sample or single key. So it sounds like this. If right now we're borrowing from the bottom, this location 0%. Almost sounds like a cheap harpsichord or something. And then of course, if I go all the way to the other end, it's going to sound really dark. Which is also kind of a cool sound, kind of ghostly. Or you could borrow from the middle and it just sounds like a really cheap old keyboard. Or something in between. Slightly bright, slightly dark. You get the idea. Okay, that's actually still pretty dark. But even this simple feature is very useful. The next mode is called Honky Tonk, and basically what this does is it tries to simulate the wear and tear you might hear on an old piano. So basically this is all deterministic. It's going to play each sample 3 times to kind of simulate what happens when you have an old piano. And obviously each key on a piano has three strings attached to it, and they can kind of fall out of tune or have different sort of quirks. So this borrows samples, adds little attack and delay changes, decay timing, like envelope stuff. And some keys might be missing a string, etc. So you pick a model. You can see this diagram here. The top row shows the keys as they're played on the keyboard. The bottom shows the keys that are being borrowed. You can also see this here in the mapping editor of Kontakt. You can you see the red ones are the ones I'm playing, and then the white ones, it's a little hard to see, but those are the ones that are actually getting used. and this kind of reflects that. So right off the bat, we're getting a little bit of wear and tear. Like this is bypassed. By default, it just kind of like borrows samples that are higher, which gives it kind of a older sound. Of course, if the age is 0, it's going to sound less old. The borrowing is going to be closer to where you started. Now, if we increase this, it'll start to add more effects, more wear and tear. If I go all the way to the top, you're going to start hearing tripling of notes to kind of mimic 3 strings on a piano per key. Sometimes maybe one of the strings is missing, like you might find on an old beat-up piano. Some of the strings might have a little bit of a strange attack or decay to them, like that one. And all these are largely consistent in how they perform. There's a little bit of I think there's a little bit of fluctuation in pitch, but for the most part they're And of course, if you don't like the model, you just pick a different one. Just go randomize it even. And each one of these models is consistent. So it's just a very quick way to dial in some strangeness or something that sounds kind of old. So the next mode is shift. You can see in the UI here that the top row and the bottom row are the same. When the timbre is 0 semitones, it means there's no offset between what you play and what comes out. And as you shift it, you see that the distance between what you play and what comes out grows. So if I go all the way up here, everything is shifted. We're borrowing samples that are 4 octaves down. And of course, if it gets all the way to the end, there's nowhere else for it to go, so those kind of stack up. But so 48 semitones up, basically very thin, and then the opposite way would be dark sound, very ghostly, similar to the tile mode. But the difference with this one is that we're not borrowing just from a single key, we're just shifting everything. So you still get a multi-sample sound. Which is nice. And you can even dial in subtle things, like instead of, if you just want maybe just a tiny bit, you can make something, slightly brighter, slightly darker. Give the piano a different character or whatever sample library you're working with. Now there's this advanced button for this mode, and this kind of opens up under the hood all the fun things that you can do to really get into this script and what it's capable of. So this first module, well, first I should talk about the staging panel over here. So this is basically some global settings. The first thing is, the mix between how much you want to hear the wet signal that you're creating and the dry signal. So, we're going to do a bunch of say we have like a fairly dark sound. We could mix it in with the original. Even just that is kind of interesting. But then you can have multiple voices, which we'll get into, and you can delay the onset of the wet voices. That's what this is for. So you can kind of hear that. And just a caveat with kontakt, with delay, you have to hold the key down. If you let go of the key before the delay time, it will not trigger. Okay, so I'll come back to the voices, but let's shift back over here. So this first panel, the differentiate panel, this basically is tied to this fate system. So the fate system is kind of like a spin on humanization, randomizing playback. Unlike traditional humanization, you can control the predictability of everything. So for instance, if I want to add some detune, let's set this back and we'll do that, and we'll have no delay. You can hear the detune there pretty strongly. So this right now is not necessarily 50 cents of detune, but it's within that range. So and the way that you can control that is here through the differentiate panel. So you can do things like control the detune predictably to, say, roots. So every C has the same detune. Every D has the same detune, etc. Like if I crank this, you can really hear. You can hear how they're all different. You could also, you could do that for, this would be in groups. So the semitones is just every key gets its own, like, repeatable. This is where the kind of the honky tonk stuff works too, where it's like each key is its own model and it's somewhat predictable. You can split the keyboard up into different ways. You could treat each octave differently, etc. This voices only mode will basically apply the same fate to every key, but each voice will have a different random fluctuation. So if I set that, these all have the same detune, but if I add a second voice, now we have two voices that are detuned differently within this range. So that's where this comes in. So let's make this a little nicer sounding. We can add a little bit of onset delay. Then we can add a little bit of delay between the actual voices with this. You can see that as I drag this up, I'm using more of this range. It's still predictable, but when it's small, they have a smaller interval. So this will give you really big, interesting delays. And then we'll do the same thing with distance, which basically has to do with how far away on the keyboard we're going to borrow from. So we're using this as our baseline, this -24, but then this is going to add more distance between those choices. So you can see that we're now borrowing from a different spot. If I change this from voices to semitones, you'll see that each key now is getting its samples from a different part of the keyboard, and it can pretty much get them from anywhere because this is what 100% distance means. It's 100% of the range we set up. And if I set it to 0, it's not going to fluctuate at all from this -24. So we'll put in a little bit. So yeah, this is kind of like recreating the Honky Tonk mode. The Honky Tonk mode has a couple of extra things that this doesn't have, like enveloping and stuff, but it's basically how that works. Now there's this flux panel, and this is more traditional humanization. So this just fluctuates these values every time. It's not predictable in any way. So if you listen to you listen to the delay. We're gonna set the mix to 100, so we're just listening to the wet stuff. We're gonna set the onset delay to 0 because this is a static delay, and that will I don't want to confuse you guys. We'll put voices to 3. So listen to how the delays sound with no flux, and then. So this is using the full range, and it's different every time versus this, which is using the full range, but it's the same every time. So that's where this comes in. Got a little handy sort of animation to kind of show you. This is very volatile when these are all the way up, and less volatile when these are more down. I usually like to have just a little bit of this stuff, but it's there in case you want it. So yeah, I mean, we could just dial in something real quick before moving on. Maybe, we're using, got a little bit of tuning. We'll bring back in the dry, add a little bit of delay, bring this down to maybe 20, 25, 15 cents or something. And maybe use more of the keyboard. That's pretty fun. Next mode to look at would be patterns. And this is basically the same as shift, except it has an additional panel that has to do with walking various patterns or mapping the way that we select stuff. So for the purposes of demoing this, I'm going to turn off all the fate stuff. I'm going to go back to a single voice. We'll start here with just a regular no offset in the timbre. So walk basically moves across the sample range in a consistent size increment, which is controlled by this gate number. So if I play just a C3, you can see I'm walking 4 samples here, or 4 key borrowing. Depending on how it's laid out, you might not hit 4 different samples, but you're going to hit 4 different keys. So why don't we try 2? So we gotta increase this if we want to go further. We could crank it here. So you can get these repeating patterns, which is kind of cool. Just something interesting to mess with. There's also seated walk, which is the same idea, but it uses the model number to create a deterministic random pattern. So with this limit of 4, it's going to cycle through 4 samples that it borrows. So you can kind of do interesting stuff like this. Get some like fun little textural patterns happening. Like if you do a limit of 3 and you have a pattern that's say 2. That one seems to be more noticeable when you play like repeated pitches, but yeah, another cool thing to mess around with. The next mode is velocity mapping. So this basically you borrow from a different part of the keyboard depending on how loud you play. So you could borrow. So the way this is set up low to high, the quieter I go, the brighter it will get because it borrows all the way from the bottom, and then the louder I play, it'll borrow from this side. just a different way to create repeatable performances. Let's try the opposite. And this might be interesting to like dial into the dry version. Hopefully you can hear that creates some sort of, it makes it start to sound like a slightly different instrument. And having this, you can combine it with these other features, which I'll demo at the end. Just want to show pitch map, which is the same idea as velocity map, but applied to what you play. And both of these maps have all these versions. This is high to low would be like switching. So the lower I play a key, you can see it's going to the opposite edge of the range to borrow. So you get this kind of strange. It's actually not strange. It just sort of like emphasizes things get brighter as you get higher and darker as you get lower. So that's actually kind of cool, especially if you maybe just dial it in. And there's different variations you can have. You can have low to random, so the bottom range of the keyboard is as it should be, and then as you get to the top, could be anything. Let me do it that way so you can hear it better. Very random. Less random over here. And these are all just variations of those ideas. But yeah, you could combine pattern with these modules that I mentioned that are also in the shift mode to get these kind of like variations, interesting variations. So you could certainly do something like this. Do 3 voices, add a little bit of, because this is controlling distance already, it wouldn't necessarily need to do anything here, although you can to create a little bit more variation. Detune though makes sense. Some delay. You could change the model, make it a little different sound. Maybe could put this on voices. Lots of chorusy sounds coming out of this. So the last thing to talk about would be the map size, which is a pretty simple feature. If I just simplify everything, we're using one voice, we're not using any fate stuff, we're not differentiating. So this is just basically no change. But if we change the map size, it's going to limit what we can use. So you could see at some point we start to fall off and it forces us to use the middle. So I could like say only use the quarter middle of the keyboard. I can't think of a utility reason to do this, but creatively it could be interesting. Basically what you get is you get very consistent, like a single sample on the low end, and then you get a single sample on the high end. So it almost like simulates taking a more robust multi-sample instrument and then just kind of chopping off the edges. So that's another fun detail. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I really enjoyed exploring this technique in the NTET script. So I thought it would be helpful and interesting to just create a standalone script that focuses on that functionality, but also has a little bit more of a feature set as far as what it can do. Obviously, piano is only going to give you a certain impression of what this can do, but certainly trying this on other kinds of samples, whether it's voices or multi-sampled, other kinds of instruments, you're going to get a slightly different impression of how this can change the sound of your instrument. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.